everybody who's on the call, thank you so much for attending. This is a webinar regarding Lotus Domino compliance, the checklist, and hopefully you see my screen right now in the first slide. My name is Jeff Tujetsch, and here's some of my information. As soon as I get PowerPoint to actually go to the next one. So bear with me. We're having a PowerPoint freeze. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so there's some of my credentials, if you will. And I guess the summation of that is I'm old. So after suddenly you're looking at this going, oh my gosh. And then the thing is that maybe the thing that's pretty cool is actually I have been at Lotus Beer, which I know is changing its name, but I've been there for 18 consecutive years. My first year was in 1996. And this also in 2013 will be 18 in a row down there. So good, bad, or indifferent, that's something about myself. And then I'd like to introduce you to Rob Axelrod. Rob is with Technotics, and he was gracious enough to join us for this webinar. We're very pleased to have him. So I am going to bring up Rob's slide about him. And Rob, take it away about yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. Like Jeff said, my name is Rob Axelrod. I'm not nearly as old as he is, so my numbers don't quite add up the way his do. But I've been working with Domino just about as long. I took a couple of years off of Lotus Sphere here and there. I did get to take the 1 year off and catch Lotus Sphere Europe in Nice back in, we were just debating, it was 16 years ago, so either 96 or 97. The one twist for me is I'm not just a Lotus guy, though I do have a deep and abiding love for all things Lotus. I'm also a messaging and collaboration guy. So I'm involved in lots of other platforms. We've been doing a lot of exciting stuff that's cloud-oriented recently. It's the right thing for some people, not so much for others. We've been helping people decide that and do deployments when necessary. That's about it about me. Jeff, why don't we kick into the presentation itself?
Sounds like a great idea. And just to make sure everybody understands, we, once again, in GoToMeeting, we're going to have questions answered. This is a one-way audio only. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask those anytime during the presentation, as well as chatting if you're having any issues with anything. And we are having somebody monitor those so that we will be on top of those. And if we don't answer your question during the presentation, we do have a question and answer time that we've allotted at the end to be able to answer those then. So let's start out with what is compliance? Who defines it and what data is involved? So what is compliance? Compliance is actually different things to different people. So some people might feel that it's about mail only. Other ones might feel that it's about making sure the door's locked on the server room. So it quite has a wide variety of things with it. So when we say compliance, we're talking about here, it might not exactly be what you expect, what your compliance means to you, but it's basically from a Domino standpoint, what are the issues, how does compliance work, what can we help to fix that? Rob, what do you think about that?
I think that's true. I think another key element to think about is who's defining compliance for you. The first thing that jumps to my mind when I hear compliance is I think about regulatory and legal issues. Those are often the driver that get us thinking about this stuff. But it's not just that. I think, Jeff, you said something interesting when we were talking about this the other day. The nut of the definition of compliance is saying what you're going to do and then doing that thing. So having a definition for how you are going to manage mail, and that definition could come internally or externally, and then executing a plan and behaving in a way that is in concert with that. Let's move on to the next.
I'm sorry?
I said go ahead on to the next slide.
Yes, absolutely. So Rob, let's go ahead and start with this on what the challenges are for compliance.
All right, so when you start to think about compliance, there's a number of big buckets that you can think about. The first one is, we talk about a lot, are the conflicting goals. When you start to think about compliance in your organization, you've got a lot of stakeholders, and they're each going to have their own attitudes about it. So you're going to have the legal department, the HR department, you're going to have general management, and then you're going to have IT. And I'm assuming most of the people on this call are from IT, and we have our own reasons for being interested in compliance, right? A lot of us might think, well, that's great, because the legal team is going to want us to delete things, and that's going to serve our own goals. And our own goals might be to keep a limited subset of data so that we can keep our costs down, right? To have tools that allow us to, in a cost-effective way, do things like legal discovery. And I've often seen organizations where the legal department wants the ability to do legal discovery, but they really don't care how it gets done or what the cost is, and that cost and challenge is just placed on the IT staff. And there you get that conflict, that dynamic between the different parts of the organization. The next element is the culture within your organization, which can often be in opposition to what people want to do from a compliance perspective. I have one customer who, actually more than one, who decided that the thing that met their legal, HR, and general compliance needs the most was to remove data that was non-business document, non-business records after pretty short order. So pretty rapidly remove things from the environment and to automate that. Well, that was in direct conflict with the culture of the organization. Like, the culture of the organization was to use their messaging systems as batteries. So just to store everything in their mail and in their other mail-oriented repositories. So you've got that conflict, that dynamic with culture within the organization. And the last piece is, once you've applied this technology, whatever it is, a methodology to archiving or around compliance, how are you to derive value from that? Right? The value isn't really derived from just the fact that you're storing things. The value is derived from being able to retrieve the information when the need is there. And that falls into a couple different buckets, right? And we'll get into those a little bit more, but at a high level, that includes doing legal discovery. So when you are engaged in a legal matter and you are forced to go out and find data, you need the tools to allow you to do that in a cost-effective fashion. And the second element is around users' ability to search for that stuff. There are often cases where there's an internal driver to find information that was created and stored some period of time ago. And the ability to just search through individual mailboxes, one at a time, by user and that user's own mail, and only the active mail, often isn't enough. So you need to provide a toolkit that's going to let them do that. Jeff, do you have anything you want to add here?
I do. With the conflicting goals, one of the things we see, even from IT, I know when we've been pinged about our products, and they say, hey, we have the mail files, and we have to archive the data because we need to keep it longer, and then we explain how the whole process works, we get a lot of comments from the Domino admins saying, so you're just moving the data from one place to another. Well, that's pretty much, unfortunately, what archiving is. So where am I going to store it? Quite honestly, legal has determined that the storage of data is much cheaper than having to not be able to search it. So, I mean, tapes and tapes and more tapes and more storage and more storage. I mean, I guess the analogy for me is, for those of you who have ever bought a new home with that bigger closets, you just find more stuff to put into those closets. So it's pretty much the same thing with mail, is I'm just going to keep things forever. And the lines of business also have conflicting issues and cultural issues, because they're saying, hey, we're the ones making money for the business here, and you're inhibiting us from doing that by deleting or archiving the mail. You're making our work harder. So once again, the conflicting goals, especially with legal and IT, I mean, a lot of times they might have both benefit from the outcome, but they might not be on the same page as to why and how the whole process works. Anything else to
I can give examples. Sure.
Go for it.
I can give examples of what you just described all day long. So let's move on to the next slide.
Okay. All right. So what variables? Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to take this one first, and then you can jump in. So
that works.
When we look at what kinds of variables are going to drive you to build a compliance model within your organization, what kinds of things go into that? Move back one. There we go. So the first, and the one that's sort of immutable, we'll start in the upper left-hand corner, are government regulations, Right? Many of us work in regulated industries, whether it's the financial industry. We have customers who are in the insurance business, let's say. Well, they have very high needs in terms of storing their data, regardless of what the users want to do, regardless of what management wants to do. There's a legal requirement through the SEC and other governmental organizations that say they need to store all business records for at least X number of years. So that's a simple one. You're going to need to comply with whatever's in your industry. But a twist to that is we all have government requirements on us that even if we're not in a regulated industry, because we are required to store documents and store business records that are material in legal proceedings. We can't intentionally destroy things for the purpose of avoiding legal liability. Right? You can delete things, and if you have business purposes to delete things, you absolutely can. But once you're engaged in a legal proceeding, or if it is fairly evident to a reasonable person that this could be a material document, you can't go deleting it. So we really all, especially in the United States, this is less of a concern outside the United States where people aren't quite as litigious, but here in the U.S., we are all subject to those government regulations. The next is risk assessment, and there's two sides to that. One is from the business perspective, sort of a little bit of what Jeff was just talking about hampering the way people work, right? If people don't have access to data or have lost data, that can actually impact your business and be costly. The greater or the more common sense of risk assessment is in a litigation situation, right? You're getting sued. Number one, you want to be able to prove your side. You want to have that data at your fingertips, unless, of course, you were engaged in malfeasance, and then it would probably be a bad thing to have it. But as a general rule, you want to be the one producing your side of the case, right? You don't want to be subject to only information that the other side has. You want to be able to easily get that. And then risk is also incurred by the incredibly high costs of discovery if you don't have good tools in place to let you do that. The next thing that drives us to having a compliance model and to investing some money in this is the market of ideas. Unfortunately or fortunately, our non-IT and IT executives read magazines. They read web pages. They fly on airplanes where there is a magazine in the pocket in front of them, where they feel compelled to read articles about things like compliance that strikes fear into their hearts, and then they drive us to action, right? I'm sure we've all experienced that, where an executive reads an article about a nightmare case, let's say in this case of discovery, or a company not following good compliance standards, and it's extremely costly, and that leads to a multi-year project for us to do. The next one is pressing. Jeff?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say it drives you to drink instead of drives you to action.
It probably drives you to drink too, for that matter. The next is precedence, and this is an interesting one. And I've seen it time and again in organizations where there will be a very loose document written policy that basically technical tools to accomplish that, and they just say something, well, the user should do what it says, everyone should have read it. And IT will, on an ongoing basis, beg for money to have a better solution. Can we please put in some kind of solution? But it's costly at first. The precedence element is that it's not until something really bad actually happens that you get that changed attitude and you get action. So you'll see that a company's compliance rules are really predicated on what has happened to that company in the past, what their experience with losses has been, what their experience with having to do really arduous discovery is. And then lastly, of course, what vertical industry you're in, right? If you're in healthcare, financial industry, anything that has those regulations, you're going to be much more interested in having a rigid compliance model than in, say, a professional services business. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
I do. And I guess some of the things I have comments on this is, you were talking about before, Rob, about the policy and adhering to it. That's what we've heard from companies. So if I say everything older than a year old is going to be deleted because I don't have any federal regulations that demand I keep my data longer, I'm going to make up a policy and I'm going to adhere to it. Where the problem comes in is for those companies that have done that have not completely adhered to the policy. So now, is it an accusation of, are you trying to destroy evidence because you're doing this? So once again, I am not a lawyer at all, but what I've heard from people is that the legal folks are telling them that as long as you make up something that is compliant with the regulations, you need to follow it to the T. So you can't just delete the mail and go, well, I wonder what's in the archives or I wonder what's on the backups. You have to be complete with this washing of the data so that you don't have anything that's an anomaly to it. And then the other thing I'd like to talk about is the extremes people go to do this. So how do you do it? Do you enforce it? Do you just have a policy for it? We've seen companies that says, okay, I'm going to make you sign a piece of paper saying I will not have any local copies of my mail anywhere. I won't take it home. I won't have it on my laptop. I won't do it. It's just a policy. They don't try to enforce it. Their way is to say, sign this paper, and it is possibly termination if you don't follow the rule. And we've seen other ones that says, I want to enforce it technically. But what the problem comes in is when do you stop? I mean, it's like living in a neighborhood and you put bars in your windows so the burglar goes to the next house. Well, then they put a security system in so they go to the next house after that. So where does maybe use a bad term here, but where does the paranoia end? Where do you stop having to stop all this? What do you think, Rob?
I absolutely think that's true. That's one of the examples I always give when we talk, usually about security. But what I like to encourage, and we'll talk about what parties you're going to engage to get to this policy and the toolkit in just a minute, but the question I always like to ask when we sit down and we're talking about risk or security or compliance is, what is the scenario you are afraid of? Describe to me what exactly the situation is, the worst case situation, the medium case situation, because a lot of times what people just fear is this nebulous, what if we don't? And it winds up being very costly and you work very, very hard. The other thing that you'll find is if you don't have them define those risks, actually articulate it and say what it is they're afraid of, you'll be managing to get to 100% instead of managing to get to 98% or 99% of the scenarios. Because just like in writing software or applying security, covering the first 90% of cases costs X. Then covering the next, 5%, so 90 to 95%, might cost X times 5. And then each additional percent after that costs X times 10. And then once you get over 99% and you start to try to whittle that down, those risks, the costs go up and up and up, and the aggravation for your user population does as well. So it is really important to have people articulate those risks just for themselves so that they can look at it and decide whether they're willing to incur the costs.
Well said, Rob. I have a couple of things to add to that. I had one call once, gosh, this was years ago, and it's for a mail tender product which has the ability to delete or archive data. And there was 2 lawyers on the call with me from the company, and one of them said to delete everything, and the other one said to save everything. So here they were, internally, they're conflicted of what they're trying to do. One is trying to prevent any data from being around. The other one's trying to save everything so they can do a search anytime they want. So, I mean, the trouble with that was I said, gentlemen, I really can't help you until one of you win, because you can't do both. And then the other story I had is I was at a prospect site, and we were talking about data on the servers and what have you. They were concerned about the Domino mail. And I said, so what about the local data on people's hard drives? And their answer was, we don't think about that. So basically their way of handling it was being an ostrich, putting their head in the sand and going, if we don't think about it, it doesn't exist. which doesn't mean that when it comes time for mitigation or legal litigation that you're not going to have issues, because I have seen things where they've seized people's machines and they'll find anything that's on there. I mean, we've all seen Garcia on Criminal Minds be able to find anything that she wants to find on somebody's laptops. Scary stuff.
Yeah, I'm getting concerned with CSI and Criminal Minds because my daughter has informed me yesterday that that is unequivocally what she wants to do because it looks like the coolest job in the world. I was having a hard time explaining to her that that's probably not how it really is day to day.
I think they glamorize it just a bit. But hey, I jumped to the next slide here. And, I'm going to take this one, Rob, if you don't mind, and then you can come in after me. Who should be championing the client? You basically have two choices. You have legal and you have information technology. And I've actually seen companies that have liaisons between these two groups because they don't communicate that well. So truly, you need both of these groups in your compliance discussions. I've actually, when I've done calls before, I get an indication of all the people in the room and what their responsibilities are, and I don't hear of a Domino admin in the room, and a lot of times I'll ask, so we don't have an admin in the room? And they'll say no. I said, well, you know what? They don't have to be here today, but I highly advise you to have somebody from the Domino team to be part of your discussions to make sure that the things that you're deciding is based in some reality. I'm not saying that you should use the technical person as the one laying out the law, but just as a sanity check of saying, can this really be done? For instance, we had somebody that, I think I was telling you about this the other day, Rob, we had a prospect a long time ago that said, I want to delete any email older than a year old, but not the ones the users haven't read yet. And I sort of turned on them because they said, can you do that? It's like, well, not really, because the unread marks are kept separately and what have you. But I said, I guess I'm sort of curious about your culture, your company, that if somebody hasn't read an email in a year and they still have a job, I guess I'm a little confused as to what the accountability is. So I didn't say it quite that bluntly, but it's just very interesting to hear what people want to do with all this. So there was, once again, a legal person saying what we want to be able to do, and the Domino technologist was not involved to be able to say, whoa, hold the horses here, we can't pull that off. But both need to be involved because legal is ultimately, let's be honest, they wield a very big stick, and typically if it comes down to it, if there is no budget, they will find the money. And I'm not talking about buying somebody's particular product. I'm just saying whatever needs to be done, hiring people, whatever the case might be, if legal is involved, things usually, I like to say, it's a push, not a pull. So they get to swim downstream. IT a lot of times has, if you don't have legal behind you, you're swimming upstream. It's really tough to get buy-in from the proper business people that are making the decisions because they don't understand the impact. I guess legal maybe creates more of a paranoia than the IT would. IT is trying to solve their technical issues. Legal is trying to solve a much less tangible kind of problem. What do you think about that, Rob?
It's absolutely true. I've been in the meetings where I've been on projects, and Jeff, I've been on them with you over the years, that have come from both sides. Ones that have come from and been driven by the IT side, and ones that have been driven by the legal side. They each have their problems. When it's driven by IT and they have not engaged legal, you can pretty much assume that project is going to be dead in the water. If legal is not involved, you will get to a point where you are ready to deploy. And I think back years ago to one of these at a pharmaceutical organization that they got almost the entire way to be ready to deploy, and then they said to legal, here's what we're doing, and that was the end of that. It went nowhere probably for another year after that while legal decided what the rules are. The flip side of the coin is we have another customer who's a consumer products company where while IT was involved, they pretty much sat back and did not provide feedback to legal when legal was building their technical requirements. So in other words, legal came up with the retention requirements, but then IT gave them no guidance as far as technical requirements. And so the things that came back from legal, in some cases, were just preposterous and incredibly complex. They were for no reason. There was really no good compliance or technical reason to do these things other than that someone in legal thought it might be a good idea and it might be interesting. It led to a lot of custom code writing, a lot of cost, and in fact, just recently I've been dealing with situations where the person that wrote a lot of that code is gone, and a lot of that complexity, no one remembers why it's there, so they really struggle with it. So you really do need both sides in there. And what Jeff said about getting money for your project and getting buy-in for your project by having legal be the driver is 100% true. The one other thing I will add, and it runs a bit contrary to what I just said, is that the first task is to come up with what, in a perfect world, legal would want the rules to be. Forgetting about technology, because you're going to give them a reality check on technology shortly. But the first thing to do is figure out, if we could do anything, what would it be that you'd want to do? What would satisfy your requirements? All right, well, I'm ready to move on.
Yeah, and I think that to add to that, it's sort of like making a bucket list and what your priorities are. What is your biggest concern first? Tackle that and then get done with it, and then move on to the next one. Because otherwise, if you don't split this up into pieces of everything you're trying to do to be compliant, it's just so overwhelming that you're going to drown in it. Okay, Rob, why don't you go ahead and run with this next slide on who should be involved.
All right, this very much speaks to the last slide when we were talking about the fact that IT and legal need to be involved. Of course, security, risk analysis, these groups also have to be involved. You'll see a lot of times, as you move down the pike with this, there's more than just email involved, right? You've got all kinds of other forms of data, and security is already doing things to manage that and to manage the flow of that and where that data is going, where it's available, where it sits. So you really do need them involved as well. Additionally, you've got the risk analysis people. In a large enough company where that's an independent group, you're going to want them involved to sort of quantify things, to determine what trade-offs you're willing to make, because there are going to be trade-offs, right? You're not going to want to save everything forever, and you're not going to want to delete everything immediately. They're going to be able to give you help with that. That's pretty much all I have to say on that one. Jeff, if you have anything, chime in.
No, I think you're right on with that, Rob. I mean, the thing is, it's a mixture of everything. In fact, we've even seen corporate communications being involved in this because of, for instance, if you're deleting mail, to make sure that the message going out to the users is worded the way that corporate communications wants it to be worded. So it is. I mean, the hardest part that we've seen, once again, I'm going to reflect back on our mail tender product, as I tell people when we're on calls, the hardest part of implementing a retention policy is actually determining what the retention policy should be. It's not so much in what and actually how to configure it or whatever, however you're doing it. It's actually getting agreement from all these groups to say, yes, we're all walking together and this is what we all want to achieve. That's just so, so difficult. And quite honestly, as I'm sure you're all aware, the more people you have in the meeting, the more difficult it is to come to a consensus on all of this.
Absolutely.
So here are some of the different things to be concerned about. And we're just throwing out some ideas here. I'm sure that some of you could come up with some other things. But here's where the data is stored. And I wanted to point out the bottom right one, which scares both Rob and I to death. And that's the local archives. The distributed data model is scary for many reasons. One is that the data is most likely not backed up. So if it's only on somebody's hard drive and that crashes, it's gone. If the laptop gets stolen, obviously there's problems. And then when it comes time for searching, good luck with that as well, because once again, you have that distributed data. So you have a lot of things to consider. So not only do you have to worry about all the data that's on our servers and what have you, but to what extent? I mean, we've seen people wanting to have retention policies on, and they wanted to log the same time chats and then get rid of them after so many days. And I basically challenge them. I say, so where does this end? Do you record phone conversations? Do you make sure faxes are thrown away? I mean, where does this process, once again, it is paranoia, but where does it end? When do you stop saying, I'm done with this, we're compliant as we can be? And not to say that, because I don't like the phrase good enough, but at some point you almost have to come up with that corporately saying, this is where we draw the line, we're done trying to enforce anything else. What do you think, Rob?
I think, yeah, I think those are all good points. The local archive one is one that you really struggle with. You know, one of our customers, sort of that head in the sand model, where their users had large quantities of archives, and they had an ambivalent policy around them. They didn't say you couldn't have them, but they didn't say you could, and they didn't technically manage it in any way. At the same time, they had deletion mechanisms that they put in for compliance, so all kinds of retention mechanisms that they put in. Well, what we discovered was a combination of those compliance routines that were cleaning out their mail file and the fact that users had limited server mail file sizes, they actually had quotas on their mail files, was leading to users wholesale archiving their mail. So once a week, someone would archive everything that was older than a year, and they had terabytes and terabytes of data on their workstations. And this is problematic for so many reasons. Number one, hard drive crashes. None of that data is backed up, and there potentially are legitimate business records in there. Number two, the data is leaving the company, right? It's on the hard drive, it's moving around. Number three, when you go to migrate someday, it's inevitable, someday everyone will migrate to some other messaging system, right? No software lasts forever. You're going to move from one thing to another. I've been doing a lot of migration projects recently, and in every one of them, a huge hot button topic is what to do with these archives. By the way, it's not just notes. You have the exact same struggle with Exchange and PST files. That is a misery for Exchange administrators. So that's really something that if you have that today, it's time to start to get a handle around that. The other thing Jeff was talking about with the other electronic sources, something that I don't think it's that recently, again, just like Jeff, I'm not a lawyer, I just play one on TV. The case is, though, as I understand it, that the medium is not as important anymore as the message is. In other words, what you're seeing in the legal community now is just the fact that something is an instant message does not differentiate it because the medium is different. Just because something is in SharePoint or Quicker or Connections does not necessarily distinguish it from an email. It's not the medium that makes the difference as far as whether it's a business record or not. It's the content and the audience that determines whether it's a business record or not. So, you know, a while ago you might have just said, well, all of instant messaging, that's casual communication. It's not business, you know, not business critical communication. I'm not going to log that. But the fact of the matter is, if you do have business communication going on with that, let's say in the financial industry and you're a broker and you're communicating with your customers over IM, and then your lawyers are probably going to say you do need to capture that. And if you're not, you might wind up getting in trouble. Now, and by the way, the trouble you get in is not just from losing a lawsuit. You can also be fined by the court in fairly significant ways, where you can be really hurt by the courts, and that's been happening from time to time now.
Yeah,
all right, that's what I have to say.
One thing we've heard before is that companies have products like SameTime that have IMing within the company. They've actually turned that off and don't want the employees to use it because they're fearful of what will be said, and they don't want to keep records of it. So, I mean, quite honestly,
which is it's incredibly unfortunate because, and I've seen that as well, but the fact of the matter is instant messaging is one of the most powerful communication tools for increasing productivity. I mean, that's been shown time and again.
I agree.
But yeah, it is unfortunate. I've seen that as well.
All right, next slide. We're going to talk about data leakage now and what types there are. So I'm just going to start off with this, Rob, and then you can throw your comments in. We have the different types. They already have no significance. We're just numbering them. So not one is more important than the other. But just to draw your attention to the data leakage issue. And some of the things that I've seen at companies is, especially with number one here, the manual and automated. The manual meaning that an employee intentionally sends an email outside the organization that possibly has proprietary information in it or what have you. That's one thing. But the automated ones, for those of you who are Domino admins, I'm sure that mail rules and users having personal agents can drive you crazy. We've seen examples of people setting up, for instance, what somebody did, every email they received, they forwarded to their home ISP mail. So everything was leaving the company that they received. So that's scary. I mean, it's bad enough somebody doing it manually, but to have it all automated, it's just frightening for that data to leave the organization. And I certainly don't mean to pick on number 5 there with the social media, but we've seen studies that companies are not allowing employees on Facebook, either at home or at work, either one. They don't want them on certain sites because they're fearful of what proprietary information will be shared. In fact, we've even heard, just to give you an idea, we've encountered companies that wanted to be able to look at every email that's leaving from a particular group to make sure that there's nothing proprietary in it. So somebody has to go through and manually review every message that a person's sending to make sure that it is nothing proprietary. So anything going outbound from inside the company to any internet address, somebody else has to review to give it a thumbs up or down. Crazy stuff, huh, Rob?
I was just going to say, which is crazy. I think we get into it in the next slide, but this is where you start to run into trouble with BYOD. You know, as you have more of a variety of devices now, people are putting stuff on their home machines. People are putting stuff on their mobile devices. As you have the convergence of different types of mobile devices being people's primary devices, as the iPad or the Surface become more real devices, so that's the only thing you need. You're going to find people behaving with BYOD, putting all kinds of stuff on those devices, and they get lost. They walk from the organization. So it really is important to have controls around that.
I think a good analogy is as we've seen with people with mobile phones having cameras, that pretty much anything you do in public is very much capturable, and somebody else might see it. And the same thing holds true with data. It could go anywhere. So not to be paranoid or increase the paranoia, but awareness is also a very important thing.
I've been trying to teach my kids that.
Yeah, that's a good lesson to teach, let me say. Okay, so now we're up to some real-world scenarios. So, Rob, you have a journaling scenario I believe you wanted to talk about.
I do. Yeah, well, we have a lot of customers that are either in regulated industries where they need to capture all of their mail, right, and journal things. But another thing that's starting to emerge is users wanting to be able to capture that as well. So keeping people sort of lean and mean on their mail side, right, so that you are following some retention rules there to keep the mail file sizes at a reasonable level. And by a reasonable level, I don't mean 100 megs. I mean a gig, 2 gigs, 5 gigs, something like that. But where you're able to have historical data that's easily searchable and accessible by a group of different parties. Number one, the user themselves, so that they can look at old data. 2, your legal team. So when a discovery instance is going on, they're going to be able to do that. And you want some granularity in that case, where they have the ability to not just have a super user maybe that can search everything, but where you can assign people to given cases so that they can look at individual people's mail files, and archives going back. And that's what you're getting with journaling, where you're really capturing everything that goes through the system. It's important to understand the difference between that journaling and archiving that comes from that, and backups, right? Backups are not a great tool for accomplishing things like legal discovery or delving into HR issues, right? I'm sure a lot of you have done this. I have a customer who probably spends, and he is the manager of the notes team there, and somehow he got tagged with this activity. I would say he spends no less than 300 or 400 hours a year, probably more than that, working on putting together sets of backups or sets of restores for legal matters, because for a variety of reasons they don't have a great tool implemented there to do archiving and searching, right? Backups have virtually no searchability as far as their data goes. They're difficult to restore. They take up a tremendous amount of space. There's a great deal of cost, whereas if you have a system in place that's doing journaling, it's capturing everything, perhaps capturing everything based on criteria, so it's not really everything, then you have easy access to all that data. It's got searchability. The next element, and that gets into searching too, obviously. The next element is the mail database management. I'm going to let Jeff talk about this because that's what Sherpa's, one of Sherpa's many specialties. And that's really what it does a nice job with.
Oh, thanks, Rob. I appreciate that compliment. So yeah, let me talk about mail database management and what we see out there. I mean, quite often we're asked, what is a good retention policy to set? So what should I do? So we've seen everything from, believe it or not, anything older than 30 days old gets deleted, to things of 90 days, 180. The common one is anywhere from a half a year to 2 years of data to keep. But I want to give you an idea of what one company did that to enforce their company retention policy. So here's what they did. They actually encumber, I should say, the user with classifying every message that they've sent or received. So if you receive a new email, you have to go in and say, this is a business record, or this is this type of category. And they actually went as far as having, I believe, 3-level categories and then subcategories underneath those. And the whole point of that is they're actually tagging the documents with the category and subcategory value, and then they were using our mail tender product to come through and apply the retention policies based upon those values. So they knew that anything that was a business record was being kept for 3 years, and then they were archiving it or whatever they wanted to do with it next. But what they were also doing was they were saying, okay, users, anything that, and actually this scenario was, anything that was older than 28 days and has not been categorized is a candidate for deletion. And their thinking is, here's pictures of my kids, you want to go to lunch today, any of those kind of things that people haven't gone through the due diligence of protecting, they're going through the deleting of it. Now, one of the things we also see is the fire shot over the bow, as I like to call it, is to basically go through and warn them, look, here's what we found in your mail that hasn't been classified yet. You're going to have 1 more week before we pull the trigger, so if you want to keep it and you need to classify it, go do that. So you're probably thinking, wow, the users have to do all that work to classifying. Now, we actually do, with our compliance attender product, have the ability to do a machine-assisted classification, which means based upon the domain or the sender, the recipient's content, what have you, to automatically assign a classification. But what we're seeing is companies want the users to go through and do that. So they can actually maybe pre-classify something automated, but they still want the users to go through and make that final decision of what is to be kept and is not to be kept. In fact, we're working with a company right now that wants to put in a retention policy. They're looking at adding a couple folders to the mail file. Anything that's in those folders is going to be kept along with things that aren't in those folders, and that's how they're, in essence, classifying messages. So we're seeing that becoming more and more popular, quite honestly, and not that the users like doing it, but maybe popular is a bad word, but more and more prevalent, maybe that's a better word for it, of that happening is for somebody to come through and the user being, once again, the one to do it, saying, what do I want to keep and what's not quite so important. And then when it comes time for searching, I mean, what does that mean to you? What do you want to search? I mean, there's, as Rob said before, there's all types of data out there. It's not just mail, though I have to admit, with our Discovery Tender product, we quite honestly almost always see mail as the only thing that people want to search. So even though you might have applications, and when I say mail, I mean journals, archives, mail files, what have you, collectively, but they're not looking at the applications or the loose files sitting on somebody's hard drive or in the network. Still, we're seeing more likely than not the blinders are on, and mail's the only thing that they're worried about. Rob, what are you seeing out there as far as what people want to search?
Yeah, I'm seeing mail for sure. You're starting to see people wanting to delve into things like social media, whether it's SharePoint. When I say social media, I mean that very loosely. Things like SharePoint or other repositories like that, whether it's Connections or Quicker, usually when it has to do with a legal matter. I also find that people who are organizations that are very heavy in chat, heavy utilizers of chat, if they have the ability to store their chats, that also has value as far as search goes, especially, obviously they're required to store their chat. But again, you're right, mail is king in this respect, though probably in the future, if you wanted to look out 36 months, its importance will wane as other media becomes more important and as younger people who have a lower level of dependence on email become more prevalent in the business world. But today, mail is still king.
All right.
The other thing I was going to throw out there real quickly with the retention and the mail file management, this is something that always surprises me, that if you say to a user, we're thinking about putting in a retention policy and we're going to delete mail, what would be a reasonable amount of time for you to retain mail? How soon should we delete it? Their answer is always going to be, not at all. Don't delete anything. I need it all. And my experience has been in a number of very large organizations that have implemented retention policies, people wind up not caring. Once they'll complain at first, and then really the adverse impact is nominal. People don't wind up missing stuff. And I'm a pack rat of the first order. I still have the email that welcomed me to PTS Learning Systems back in probably 1993 or 94. Oh it's on the CD somewhere, but yeah, I still have it. But I've worked plenty of places that have implemented those kind of retention policies, and it's no big deal when your mail goes away because you find you're not looking at the old stuff that much, especially if you give people, as you were saying, a way to tag those documents that they need, that are genuine business records that are going to get retained for a longer period of time. All right, let's move on. We're running out of time.
That we are. Okay, the next slide we have here is just showing some of the solutions and how Sherpa software can help you with these problems that we've been describing. So what we have here is we have our 3 products and how they address all the different things that we've been talking about for this past 45, 50 minutes. So you'll see that within the yellow, the mail attender can help you with the message management, which including the archive and deletion. We can also help you with the classification on that with a user-based classification. Compliance attender can help you with the journaling as well as the machine-assisted classification. And then obviously, as discovery attender's name would suggest, it does searching of Domino mail file, anything to do with mail file, archive, journal, what have you. It can also search Domino applications, and it can also reach out to search loose files like things like Word documents, PowerPoint presentations that are sitting on either a network drive and or a loose file sitting on somebody's hard drive. So we can help you out with all that. But one of the things I wanted to bring your attention to, is actually not on this slide, is another way of compliance that we've seen as well. Compliance Attender has a feature called Tone Check. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I know it's going to sound crazy to you, but basically what it does is it will prevent a message that has a negative tone to be sent out. So basically, there's a way for the admin to saying, I only want to allow this much negativity, and we have a thing that goes through a tonalization, and it'll actually say, this message is too negative. You must fix these words before you can send it. So that's another thing of compliance that we're seeing out there. Pardon me. And the reason is because there have been precedences that employees have been fired because of negativity of their mail. They're sending out flames, and they think that I'll put everything in caps and I'll speak my mind. And one of my favorite sayings is save as draft. You know what? If you think you need to get that off your chest, type it up. Don't put anybody in the address field. And then when you're all done, just delete it. You know what? Just, you feel better? Great. but some people think they have to share their thoughts with other people, and that's where the tone check comes in. Crazy stuff. Well, actually, this is the information of all that. Rob, do you have anything else to add before I talk a little bit about what else everybody can expect to get from us?
No, that's pretty much all I've got. We came in right on time.
I think we are. Well, I wanted to make sure that everybody's aware that there will be a follow-up, which will include a free white paper called Email Regulatory Compliance, Compliance, Preparing Your Organization. Everybody will be sending out one of these. You'll receive those in the next few days. And we're also looking for any questions. I don't see any questions from anybody. So if I'll give you a minute here to think of something. If you don't have it, we don't have to go the full minute. But at the same time, I didn't want to cut somebody off. So if you do have any questions, now's the chance. Otherwise, we will be all done. So once again, I want to thank you for your time in advance here. And for Rob, thank you so much for being such a great contributor to all this. Your discussions about everything and the real-world experiences, I think, is what really sticks to things. Because you know what? There's things that people can have theories on, but the real application and how people are doing is what really matters. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. That's true in just about everything.
Absolutely it is. So well, let's all keep Rob in our thoughts because he's in lovely Philadelphia, and they're getting a nor'easter coming through there, which I believe is heading up the East Coast to Boston and New York as well. So, Rob, we hope you keep your power for the next few days.
Yeah, I could use another day of not being able to work. I kind of like that concept.
Oh, forced vacation. Got it.
Yeah, then I don't feel so guilty if I really can't work.
Okay, yeah, it's not like it's a choice, right?
Correct.
Okay, well, we don't see any questions. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end this webinar. Once again, thank you very much for attending, and a special thank you to Rob for everything you've done and helping us out with this.